Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's keynote presentation titled Artificial Intelligence in Times of COVID-19, the COVIDNet Open Source Initiative. This webinar is part of the Clinical Diagnostics and Research event, and I am Susie Valdez of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. So let's get started. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you first to participate by communicating with other attendees using our new live chat feature during the presentation. You can find that live chat located on the right of your screen. You can also participate by submitting as many questions as you'd like during this presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click Send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. Now, if you have any trouble seeing or hearing this presentation, simply click on the Help Desk button located at the bottom of your screen within the navigation bar or from the lobby. Finally, a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the Continuing Education Credits tab located on the abstract window below the presentation window and follow the process to obtain those credits. I now introduce today's speaker, Dr. Alexander Wong, the Canada Research Chair in Artificial Intelligence and Medical Imaging, member at the College of the Royal Society of Canada. For a complete biography of our speaker, please visit the Biography tab at the left of your screen. Dr. Wong, welcome. You may now begin your presentation.
Hi, I'm Alexander Wong. I'm a Canada Research Chair in the area of Artificial Intelligence and Medical Imaging at the University of Waterloo. And today I'm going to talk about some of our work on the COVIDNet Open AI initiative, which is our focus on open source AI to help with support with clinical decision support during the pandemic. And so one of the interesting things I always like to bring up, just as kind of like a reflection of what has been happening during the pandemic, was actually a slide that I showed from the Johns Hopkins dashboard early in the pandemic when I first gave a talk. And at the time, it was already a pandemic of global scale. We had a novel virus with limited treatment options and no vaccines at all. Then after a few months, I gave a talk again, and the situation has gotten an order of magnitude worse. So it's still a pandemic of global scale that has really gotten out of control, and it still had a novel virus with limited treatment options and still no vaccines at that particular time. And so what is the situation like now, right? So as you can see, with the number of infections, it has increased by another order of magnitude. It still remains a continuing pandemic of global scale across the world. And it's still a novel virus with limited treatment options, but now, thankfully, we have vaccinations taking place worldwide. And that's kind of state where we are. And so one of the most important parts of managing the COVID-19 pandemic has been active screening, with RT-PCR testing being one of the most prominent approaches for testing whether a person has a COVID-19 infection. So on the positive side, RT-PCR has actually quite high specificity. However, it's actually quite time consuming to perform a test, taking more than 1 day before results. And in the past, I've seen situations where it took as much as a week. And not only that, it's a very lab intensive process. And so there's really short supply in many countries, even to this very day. And one of the key things a lot of people didn't realize is that there's actually varying level of sensitivity depending on where you swab, be it a throat swab, a nasal swab, so on and so forth. And in the more recent study, what they found is that the positive rate actually goes down as symptom onset. And so what you see on the right is that the longer somebody has had the COVID-19 infection, the harder it is to actually detect it. And so RT-PCR, while being the gold standard testing approach, has certain limitations. And so more recently, there's been a much greater use of antibody or antigen testing. And the great advantage of these approaches is that they're very fast, so it takes minutes, so you can do it at any time to check your results. It also has high specificity, but compared to RT-PCR testing, with antibody testing, antigen testing, the sensitivity is significantly lower to the point where earlier in the pandemic, what the National COVID Scientific Advisory Panel in the UK stated was that currently available commercial LFIA devices do not perform sufficiently well for individual patient applications. And so while antigen tests are being much more widely used now and technology has improved, its sensitivity still remains quite poor compared to a lot of other techniques. And as a result of the limitations of these testing approaches, well, biggest being that even if you're able to identify whether a person has COVID-19 infection, you cannot use these tests to assess the severity level of that condition for treatment planning, triaging, resource allocation, and so on and so forth. There's been a significant interest in the use of chest radiography as a complementary screening approach. And so what does chest radiography allow for? The first thing is rapid triaging. One of the beauties about chest radiography is that you can actually get very fast acquisitions compared to a lot of other medical imaging modalities. And so in general, chest radiography can be done in parallel to viral testing, as is often the case. And in fact, it's actually clinical routine in many situations for patients with respiratory complaint to also get an additional radiography screening using chest radiography. And so this is really standard procedure. The other good thing about chest radiography is the availability and accessibility. And so in general, compared to other imaging modalities, it's relatively low cost, low maintenance, and it's also readily available in most clinical sites, both in developing countries as well as developed countries, and it's essentially standard equipment in most healthcare systems. And not only that, chest radiography comes in portable forms, and so it can be used in a number of different ways that other modalities cannot be used. So for example, chest radiography systems, so portable chest x-rays, can be performed in isolation rooms to minimize the risk of transmission during the transport system compared to fixed systems, can actually be brought to rural areas. I've actually talked to a lot of clinical partners and collaborators where they actually fly the portable chest x-ray systems directly to areas without medical care. And it's also much easier to decontaminate compared to other modalities. But last but not least, the most important aspect of chest radiography is that it allows for risk stratification, which you cannot do with RT-PCR testing or antigen testing. So what that means is that by looking at the chest x-rays, you can actually get insights into the risk level and severity of the individual. And so this allows for improved population management and also facilitates for individualized care based on risk. And so with all these advantages at the time, when the pandemic first started, we decided to launch the COVIDNet initiative, which has now grown into a global deep learning initiative for COVID-19 clinical decision support. One of the unique aspects of our initiative has been the fact that it is the first and largest open source, open access initiative for deep learning for COVID-19 clinical decision support. And so you could be able to access everything from that URL there. And not only that, we provide continuously improvements over time with new releases, new updates of both new models as well as new data to support the research and clinical community. This whole COVIDNet initiative started off as a team of two, so myself and my student at the time, Linda Wang, but now it has grown significantly both in terms of the size of the team as well as in terms of scope of the different tasks that we cover for COVID-19 clinical decision support. In fact, right now it is the most widely used AI models of its kind for COVID-19 in the world, and it's used around the world on all continents and has been customized for handling different use cases as well as different demographics and environments. So what we started off with was detection and risk stratification from chest radiography now covers a much broader range of clinical decision support tasks across a much wider range of medical modalities. And so we are very happy to have received global support as well as coverage to help facilitate, enable, and accelerate our particular initiative. And so a high-level overview of the COVIDNet initiative in a nutshell. The COVIDNet initiative is now comprised of 6 main initiatives. The first main initiative is COVIDX, where we have built the largest, most diverse open access benchmark datasets related to COVID-19 imaging. The next initiative is the COVIDNet CXR initiative, which was focused on creating tailored deep learning models for SARS-CoV-2 detection from chest X-ray images. Next, we have the COVIDNet S initiative, which is focused on tailored deep learning models for SARS-CoV-2 severity assessment from chest X-ray data. The COVIDNet CD initiative, which focuses on creation of tailored deep learning models for SARS-CoV-2 detection, as well as risk stratification for computed tomography data. The COVIDNet US initiative, which is one of our newer initiatives, which is focused on creating tailored deep learning models as well as data for SARS-CoV-2 detection and risk stratification from ultrasound data. And last but not least, the COVIDNet ML-CIS initiative, which is focused on creating a fully integrated clinical decision support system for COVID-19 that integrates all of the previous initiatives together into a clinical viable platform. And the goal here is to have this platform available to facilitate for COVID-19 treatment planning, for risk stratification, for detection, as well as triaging. And so now I'm going to talk about each of these individual initiatives in a lot more detail. And so the very first initiative has been the COVIDX initiative, and that centers around creating the largest open access data set of its kind. And so here what we were able to do with the help of a lot of the different partners worldwide was create a data set consisting of over 15,000 patient cases across 51 different countries. And the more important part is that we try to do it in a very diverse manner. So this COVIDX dataset consists of data under different views, so anterior posterior, posterior anterior, different imaging system types, be it portable, fit, or fixed, different positions, supine, upright, across different gender and age demographic groups, as you can see from this table, and so on and so forth. Because what we want to do is create a data source for researchers, scientists, clinicians, so on and so forth, to leverage and provide greater learning diversity and generalization, so we could better apply under different environments and situations. And so next is the how did we actually do this? So one of the key aspects that we're doing has been, how do we actually develop highly efficient, highly accurate, and highly trustworthy AI models in a rapid manner given the urgency of the pandemic? And so in order for us to do it, especially when we start off with a team of 2, is the underlying idea of human-machine collaborative design, which is based on the premise that why don't we design AI models via a human-driven design and requirements, but with the fine-grained meticulousness of machine-driven exploration, along with machine-enabled, human-driven auditing and validation. So using this human-machine collaborative approach, we're actually treating AI as a collaborator to work with us to build better solutions that are more accurate, that are more efficient, and last but not least, highly trustworthy. And so by taking this human-in-the-loop approach, it has enabled us to be able to really create great models and release them in an open source manner through our COVIDNet initiative, compared to a fully handcrafted approach and versus a fully automated approach. A handcrafted approach simply takes way too long, and also it's very hard to guarantee full quality, while a fully automated approach might speed up the process, but it becomes a black box that is very hard to understand and trust. And so by taking a human in the loop approach, it has allowed us to have a very great balance between the two. And so how does a human-machine collaborative design approach work? And so first we talk from the human aspect. So as the human designer, the first thing we do is we create a design prototype so that we can scope exactly what the task and type of data we're actually dealing with and how they could possibly interact with each other. And so first thing a human does is create a design prototype. The next thing is to then also feed in the underlying data source that interacts with the design prototype. Last but not least is to provide the operational requirements for the machine to learn from to be able to produce better improved models that meet those requirements. So from a clinical perspective, what's important to us here is we would like the machine to explore different options and find me the optimal model that gives me the best sensitivity, the best positive predictive value, the best specificity, and so on and so forth. And so taking our design prototype that we've created, so a rough scaffolding of what it's supposed to do, the underlying data, in this case, medical data, as well as the operational requirements, which is it needs to hit a certain level for sensitivity, for specificity, and so on and so forth. All of that is fed into a machine-driven design exploration platform, in this case, our generative synthesis approach, where it goes through a number of different cycles to identify and spec and figure out what is the best tailored model for this particular task and data at hand while meeting the operational requirements. So this is quite a bit of a paradigm shift from our usual thought process, which is given the data and the requirements, we will go through an iterative process and do it by hand. And so this allows us to do a number of different things. So the first thing is that it enabled us to create very lightweight microarchitecture and macro-architecture designs in the underlying AI model, in this case, a deep neural network, that we would not be able to do by hand. Because with a machine, it's able to identify and tweak and construct at a synapse level, at a neuron level from a neural network perspective, but which is pretty much impossible for a human to do. And by having these very lightweight microarchitecture and macroarchitecture design, it really allows us to build systems that are much more easily deployable. So rather than systems that rely on the cloud, it allows us, or very heavy compute, it allows us to create models that are lightweight enough to fit on a small embedded system within the medical device itself so that it could be portable and used directly in real time at low cost. And not only that, it allows for the exploration for more optimal architecture designs that has a much better trade-off than what we can do. So for example, in this case, this is a picture of the COVIDNet CXR architecture. And what you can see are a number of different things. One is that it's comprised largely of depth-wise as well as point-wise convolutions. And these are very lightweight components, which allows for much smaller memory footprint and real-time performance. Not only that, it has a very high architecture diversity, way beyond what a person can design, because a machine can tailor directly around the task as well as data at hand. It creates selective long-range connectivity to facilitate for better training of the models as well as propagation of information through these long-range silos. And so the result is that it allows us to create significantly lower complexity systems compared to what's out there, but while being lower complexity, has actually greater sensitivity. So in this case, greater than 95% on a particular cohort. But then the question here is, great, we use this human-machine collaborative design approach, the first step, to build a model in an automated fashion that's really catered around the task. And it achieves great numbers from an overall perspective. But are we just happy with it, ready for deployment? The answer is no, because there's quite a lot more to it, especially from a clinical perspective. And so what is particularly important is that when we're releasing clinical models, what's very important is that we need to take a very responsible approach in what we actually release and deploy. And so to release a model into the wild based purely on just the accuracy numbers is probably not the best idea. We kind of want to have a much deeper insight into how it's actually behaving and making these particular decisions that is being then channeled to clinicians. And so a very important step as part of this human-machine collaborative design approach is not just the design and building of the model itself, but the design auditing phase. And so every model in the COVIDNet initiative are not only created using this general approach, but they've also been audited using a explainable AI system for responsible AI and governance. And so how do we actually do this auditing? We use a number of different explainability approaches. The very first one that we use is called quantitative explainability. So what is quantitative explainability? In general, explainable AI is AI that kind of gives you an explanation as to how it's actually making its decision. But in most explainability approaches, they're very qualitative. So what that means is that they might have a little bit of highlight here and there to kind of say, this might be a bit more important than that other aspect, but you don't get a good sense as to the concrete reason is what exactly is the influence of this component, what actually is the critical factor that led to decision, and what is the rationale behind it. And so with quantitative explainability, what you can see on the right, it provides the concrete exact insight into the critical factors to the model decision. So in this particular case, what you see is clearly what's highlighted in the area is the critical factor that led to a COVID-19 prediction. And in this case, it's the underlying ground glass opacities in the lung that led to the decision. But not only that, we also leverage a counterfactual driven explainability approach that gives the quantitative insights into the impact of the critical factors against alternative decisions. So what that means is this counterfactual aspect gives you the justification to this explanation. So what you can see on the right is that by looking at this particular critical factor, it led it to have a certain amount of confidence that this is a COVID-19 infection, because under other circumstances where this critical factor is not being leveraged, it would have thought that it's standard community pneumonia. And so this becomes very important for us to really understand the intrinsic behavior in the decision-making process of all the models that we create. And so why is this even important? Doesn't it always make the right decisions for the right reasons? The answer is no. One of the biggest benefits of leveraging a design auditing approach is that it helps weed out right decisions for the wrong reasons early, well before further development as well as deployment. And so here are some examples of where we are able to identify right decisions for the wrong reasons. So on the left are some chest x-ray images. And so in our initial prototyping of our system, what we found using this quantitative explainability approach was that it was actually making a lot of right decisions. So we had really great score, very great sensitivity, specificity. However, it was getting these great results by never looking at the actual lungs themselves, but by looking at the embedded text to make a decision, which is completely nonsensical, but it's able to do it because at the end of the day, from a machine learning perspective, its underlying objective is to get a better result. How it gets it there is really just based on whether it doesn't really truly understand the intrinsic context of the situation. And so what it found was that by relying on embedded text, I could get great results. So why don't I just use embedded text? And so by identifying this early, we were able to take actionable insights in terms of removing such text, and lo and behold, as soon as we remove that kind of text, it's able to then identify the key critical factors in the lungs that led to the decision of a COVID-19 infection or not. On the right is a very similar and interesting example for computed tomography, so CT scans. So what you see on the right is a initial prototype of a CT system for identifying COVID-19, where it was, again, getting extraordinarily high sensitivity and specificity by never looking at the lungs, by never even barely looking at the body. What it did was it always was able to identify whether or not there was a COVID-19 infection based on the type of patient bed they were lying on. Again, this is completely nonsensical, but the system doesn't know any better, and it games the data around it. And so by identifying this, we were able to take actionable insights simply by removing the bed from the CAT scans, and lo and behold, again, it was able to learn to look and focus on the disease areas within the lung to make its decisions. And so this allowed us to create much more trustworthy systems at the design level through greater understanding into the behavior of the decision-making process. And so what the other key advantage of this explainability approach, and we have leveraged this to enable better systems, was it allows for radiologist validation into the behavior of the actual COVIDNet models themselves. So our COVIDNet models have not only been verified at the design time through design auditing, it's also been verified from a radiologist perspective based on our radiology collaborators who are able to use these types of explanations that are provided to get a deeper insight into whether or not it's behaving correctly. And so our systems have been validated by expert radiologists to ensure that the decision-making behavior as surfaced by the explainability is consistent with radiologist interpretation. And this also allows us to validate the quality of the data. As you saw with the earlier cases, there are quality issues like embedded text, and also, and there's other data that has imaging artifacts and so on and so forth. By taking this explainable AI approach, it allowed us to identify all of these individual issues and either correct for it or exclude data that doesn't meet the quality requirements. And so a team of expert radiologists was able to examine both the radiology images as well as the actual visual indicators as indicated by the explainability as leveraged by the networks to make decisions to verify whether or not the systems are behaving properly. And through this iterative process, we're able to directly produce COVIDNet models that are not only high in accuracy, high in efficiency, but also is behaving in a way that matches the radiologist's interpretation. And so stemming from starting off from the initial COVIDNet CXR initiative, because of the success of the project, we've greatly expanded the capabilities of this particular initiative to cover a much broader range of clinical tests across different modalities. So the first one we extended was COVIDNet S, which is for risk stratification. And so what we did was we assessed the feasibility of assessing lung severity of SARS-CoV-2 patients. And this is very critically important because it really guides decisions on treatment planning. Should a patient use a ventilator? Should they undergo just oxygen therapy? Should they be admitted to ICU and so on and so forth? It essentially allows them to decide the next steps on how to best care for a particular patient. And so what we did was we tested feasibility by leveraging the scoring system by Wong et al., which is based around two different severity indicators. One is the geographic extent of the disease, so the extent of the lung involvement by ground glass opacity or consolidation, as well as the opacity extent, which is the degree of opacity in the patient's lungs. And what you see on the right side is different situations under low severity, medium severity, as well as high severity for geographic extent, as well as for opacity extent. And this is in collaboration with our clinical partners at Stony Brook Medicine, as well as Montefiore Medical Center in New York State, US. And this is the largest data set of its kind, and we've made this available in an open source, open access manner. And so based on this, what we also did was build a second system that is based around the scoring from the RSNA lung airspace disease grading. So based on 3 zones per lung, as well as severity based on the opacity of the 6 different lung zones. And using this information, we were able to demonstrate the feasibility of deep learning for computer-aided severity assessment for SARS-CoV-2 severity. We have greater than 92% accuracy, and we're continuing to improve our systems and explore based on these very promising directions. Another area that we focused on has been beyond just chest x-rays. One of our next steps was, during the early days of COVID-19, CAT scans or computer tomography scans were actually leveraged quite a lot for COVID-19 infection analysis. While it's being used much less now, for direct diagnostic purposes, it's still being leveraged by a lot of radiologists and clinicians to identify whether a patient is at the risk of COVID-19 in terms of its overall severity at the time, in situations where a patient needs to, let's say, go for a scan before an operation or post-operation, or for other purposes. So essentially, during these doing these procedures that are unrelated to actual COVID-19, using this as a complementary source to see whether or not there is a potential breakthrough, a potential infection, so actionable items can be done to take care of it. And so what we did was we built COVIDNet CD to assess COVID-19 infections from CAT scans. And so what we did was we trained on over 200,000 CAT scan images or CT scan images, which is the largest and most diverse cohort available in open access form. Again, all available through the COVIDNet Open Access Initiative. And what we're able to do was leverage this exact same process to automatically create a tailored AI model for tackling the task of CT scan detection and risk stratification to strong success, as well as using the data auditing approaches through explainability to really understand and make sure that the models are actually identifying the right things to make a decision. So as you can see here, highlighted in red are the different areas that the model actually leveraged to make its decision. And this was then clinically validated by radiologists to ensure that it is looking at the right biomarkers. And in this case, it was. Next, what we did was we then expanded further into the realm of ultrasound. There's been a lot of a recent trend around leveraging point-of-care ultrasound, so POCUS systems, for doing COVID-19 assessments and screening, so for detection as well as risk stratification. And so what we did was, in collaboration with the National Research Council of Canada, so NRC, we were able to create a systematic framework for curating data with over 10,000 point-of-care ultrasound images, now also open access, open source, available to the community to leverage in a very clean and systematic manner to further advance their research as well as other clinical tasks. And not only that, based on this data source, what we then did was leverage this COVIDNet US to then create COVIDNet US, which is a tailored deep neural network for SARS-CoV-2 detection based on point-of-care ultrasound data. And so once again, by using this human-machine collaborative approach, what we're able to do is create models that are highly architectural heterogeneity, tailored for this specific task, allowed us to introduce an attention condenser network, which allows us to really pay specific attention to what's important in a very efficient way. And so the result is the underlying COVIDNet US was able to achieve an area of the curve greater than 0.98, yet being 353 times fewer parameters, so lower complexity, 62 times fewer flops, so much lower computational complexity, and running 14.3 times faster on a Raspberry Pi compared to the typical ResNet 50. And so once again, this has allowed us to really create very efficient yet highly performant models that can integrate directly into systems. And right now, we're actually exploring the integration of this directly into a portable ultrasound system to create a very high-performing AI-powered ultrasound system for identification of COVID-19 as well as risk stratification. Next, what we did was we expanded it for more predictive analytics, so essentially for treatment planning. So the first thing we did was we introduced COVIDNet Clinical ICU, where the underlying goal is to build tailored deep learning models for predicting ICU admission, which is a very important task in the clinical workflow for personalized care of individuals with COVID-19. And so what we did was we actually leveraged explainability to actually improve AI model design while gaining system-level insights. And so how do we do this? What we did was during the actual model creation process, what we did was we audited the model using the quantitative explainability that I mentioned earlier to help us identify at a system level what are the most important factors that is being leveraged by this initial AI prototype in making its decision for predicting ICU admission. But not only that, we also identify which particular factors actually degraded its overall performance. And so by understanding what are the key factors that led to better decisions and ones that hinder decisions, what we were able to do was then exclude the factors that did not actually improve, but actually led to a degradation in its overall predictive performance. And as a result, it allowed us to create a more streamlined, efficient system compared to before that actually led to greater predictive capabilities and accuracy. And so explainability not only allows you to actually really understand the behavior system for checks and balances to ensure that you validate it before you release it in the wild, it actually allowed us to build a system that actually performed better. So that's a very important secondary goal that, or secondary benefit that quantitative explainability allows for. But not only that, what we did was beyond quantitative explainability, we also did trust quantification. So with explainability, it's about understanding why AI is making certain decisions. When it comes to trust quantification, is understanding when and where this AI can produce a trustworthy answer. And this is especially important for garnering deeper understanding of potential demographic biases. Because at the end of the day, the data itself might not be perfect. And so when you have imperfect data, and it's being learned by a AI model, in this case, COVIDNet Clinical ICU, you really want to understand whether or not it makes equally or similarly trustworthy decisions across, let's say, gender, across age, and so on and so forth. And so during this auditing process, using trust quantification, we were able, fortunately, identify that the final COVIDNet Clinical ICU model had equal trustworthy predictions for both males as well as females from a gender demographic perspective, but also had very similar levels of trustworthiness for predictions both for the older population as well as for the younger population. So by understanding that it's behaving not only in a very highly accurate way, but also with decisions that are sound, we're also able to identify here that it's actually making decisions in a relatively fair way. And so, last but not least, we've also wanted to, it's one thing to just build models and release it in open source, open access, and expect people to be able to use it. But when it comes to clinicians and other clinical scientists, being able to access these models in a seamless manner for different clinical studies, case studies, and so forth and as well as for clinical integration is much more important. And so what we did was, having built all these different models that we're continuing to improve over time, we've also started the COVIDNet Clinical Decision Support Platform initiative, where we're building a full clinical support platform that integrates directly into existing clinical healthcare IT platforms to enable case management, improve clinical viewing of COVID cases, diagnosis, as well as prognosis visualization for COVID cases, full clinical integration, as well as automatically generate reports that can greatly improve both the consistency as well as the efficiency of the clinical decision support process for COVID-19. And so again, this entire software platform is also open source and publicly available through the COVIDNet initiative. And so where do we go from there? What's next as part of the COVIDNet initiative? So we continue to release new and improved models and data on a regular basis, and a lot of the scientific community has been leveraging it to greatly accelerate their research. We continue to advance these generative strategies for machine-driven design exploration during the human-machine collaborative studies because we found this approach to be very effective, and we would like to spread it within the research community to help further research along different areas. We're working with clinical institutes around the world for feedback and evaluation. At the end of the day, the main goal is beyond just research advancements, is to have systems that can then integrate into clinical institutes to support our healthcare workers. We're also incorporating additional patient metadata, such as comorbidities, vital signs, blood tests, medical history, and so on and so forth, to have much more complete clinical decision support. We've also expanded our COVIDNet initiative beyond just COVID-19. So we recently released TBNet, which are open source AI models for tackling the problem of tuberculosis screening, which is one of the most deadly, if not the most deadly infectious disease around the world. We've also extended towards CancerNet, which is, can we leverage our findings and learnings in the models we build and transfer this knowledge for cancer diagnosis and prognosis? And as usual, we're always looking for collaborations from around the world. So feel free to contact me at any time. I'm happy to collaborate. And last but not least, I'm going to do special thanks to our now pretty large COVIDNet team, consisting of researchers and collaborators worldwide. Also love to thank the hospitals that have collaborated and worked with us on our different initiatives, because without clinical partner support, none of this would happen. And also want to thank the different corporate partners for supporting our project, our initiative all this time. And so thank you very much for listening. And my email's down there. If you're interested in collaboration, definitely let me know. We're always expanding this project to make sure that we provide as much as we can to the community at large.